December 1941. An NKVD officer approaches a suspected collaborator in a Moscow apartment building, carrying what appears to be a standard D-cell flashlight. The corridor is narrow. Two witnesses stand nearby. The officer raises the flashlight as if to illuminate the suspect's face. At contact distance, he presses a concealed trigger mechanism integrated into the flashlight's casing. A 7.62 mm bullet fires through a barrel disguised as the flashlight's reflector assembly, striking the suspect in the forehead. The sound is approximately 110 decibels, loud enough to be heard as a gunshot, but muffled enough by the enclosed barrel that witnesses in the stairwell below report hearing only a heavy door slam. The suspect drops immediately. The officer lowers the flashlight, unscrews the front assembly to extract the spent casing, reloads from a pocket, and walks away. To anyone observing casually, he carried a flashlight into the building and carried a flashlight out. The weapon that killed the suspect was designated the flashlight gun in NKVD inventory records, and between 1937 and 1945, it executed hundreds of individuals in circumstances where conventional firearms would have drawn immediate attention or created witnesses capable of identifying a weapon. Soviet state security forces in the 1930s and 1940s faced an execution problem that was logistical and political. The NKVD conducted targeted eliminations of suspected enemies of the state, defectors, and foreign intelligence personnel, both within Soviet territory and abroad. Standard execution methods using conventional pistols were effective, but created multiple complications. Gunshots attracted attention. Witnesses could identify weapons and potentially trace them to the state security apparatus. Executions in public or semi-public spaces risked intervention or escape. Suppressed weapons existed but remained identifiable as firearms and were difficult to conceal in civilian clothing during the approach. What NKVD operational planners required was a weapon that appeared to be a common household object, that could be carried openly without suspicion, that killed reliably at contact distance, and that could be deployed and fired before the target understood they were threatened. The weapon had to be simple enough for field operatives with minimal firearms training and robust enough to function reliably after prolonged carry in varying conditions. Development occurred at a specialized NKVD technical facility in Moscow, the precise location and designation of which remained classified in Russian archives. The designers, whose identities were never publicly disclosed, approached the problem by selecting common objects that could plausibly contain a single-shot firearm mechanism. Flashlights were chosen because their cylindrical shape naturally accommodated a barrel. Their battery compartment could house firing mechanisms and ammunition, and their legitimate use required pointing them at targets, making weapon orientation instinctive. The design constraint was miniaturizing a functional firearm mechanism into a space approximately 25 mm in diameter and 150 mm in length, while maintaining the external appearance and basic functionality of an actual flashlight. The weapon used a modified 7.62 by 25 mm Tokarev pistol cartridge with reduced propellant charge, bringing muzzle velocity down to approximately 250 meters per second. This was subsonic for the cartridge, but adequate for lethal effect at contact range. The barrel was a steel tube 120 mm long, positioned along the flashlight's central axis, where the bulb reflector assembly would normally be. The breech was a simple hinged block that opened laterally for loading. The firing mechanism used a spring-loaded striker released by a mechanical trigger integrated into the flashlight's side switch. Pressing the switch in a specific pattern, typically 2 rapid presses, disengaged the safety and fired the weapon. This prevented accidental discharge while allowing rapid deployment. The front of the barrel was concealed by a perforated cap that appeared to be the flashlight lens but allowed the bullet to pass through. A small incandescent bulb was positioned off-axis and actually functioned, allowing the device to serve as a working flashlight for brief periods, enhancing the disguise. Operational deployment began in the late 1930s during the Great Purge, though documentation from this period is fragmentary. The weapon was issued to selected NKVD operatives conducting eliminations of political targets in urban environments where conventional methods would attract excessive attention. NKVD reports from the period, partially declassified in the 1990s, reference flashlight devices used in operations but provide minimal technical detail. The weapon's effectiveness was measured not by the number of kills, which were modest compared to conventional execution methods, but by the absence of witnesses capable of providing meaningful evidence. Targets killed with the flashlight gun often died in circumstances where observers could not definitively state what had occurred. The sound was ambiguous. The weapon was immediately concealed. The operative departed before the body was discovered. This operational security was the weapon's primary value. Comparison with Western concealed weapons reveals different design philosophies. The OSS developed cigarette pack guns and pen guns, single-shot devices chambered in .22 caliber, designed for assassination or escape scenarios. These were smaller and more easily concealed, but fired weak cartridges requiring multiple shots for reliability. The British SOE produced various disguised firearms, including belt-buckle guns and pipe guns, but these were generally .22 caliber or smaller and designed for defensive use rather than offensive elimination operations. The NKVD flashlight gun was unique in using a full-power pistol cartridge, albeit modified, in a disguise that remained functional as the object it imitated. This required more sophisticated engineering than Western equivalents and reflected different operational priorities. Soviet doctrine assumed operators would have opportunities to approach targets closely in environments where carrying a flashlight was unremarkable. There were significant limitations. The single-shot capacity meant missing or failing to achieve immediate incapacitation left the operative defenseless. Reloading required unscrewing the front assembly, extracting the spent case with a small tool, inserting a fresh cartridge, and reassembling the device. This process took approximately 30 seconds and could not be performed covertly in the presence of witnesses. The reduced propellant charge meant the weapon was effective only at contact range, typically under 2 meters. Beyond this distance, accuracy was poor and stopping power was insufficient. The mechanical trigger required deliberate activation that could potentially warn an alert target. The disguise was effective only during the approach and the immediate aftermath. Any forensic examination would identify the object as a weapon. Most critically, the weapon could not be test-fired without revealing its nature, meaning operatives carried devices whose function they could verify only through training simulators or actual operational use. Manufacturing was limited and controlled entirely by NKVD technical services. Estimates based on partial inventory records suggest fewer than 500 units were produced between 1937 and 1945. Each weapon was issued to a specific operative and tracked through internal security protocols. Lost or captured units triggered extensive investigations. The weapons were not serialized in a conventional sense, but used internal markings that identified the manufacturing batch and issue date. After 1945, production apparently ceased as operational doctrine shifted and the security environment changed. Most surviving examples were destroyed during the 1950s as part of broader inventory reduction programs. A handful reached Western intelligence services through defections or recovery operations, where they were analyzed and documented but not widely publicized during the Cold War for reasons of operational security. Post-war analysis by Western intelligence agencies focused on the weapon's engineering as much as its operational use. The integration of a functional firearm into a working flashlight required precision machining and careful material selection to manage the stresses of firing while maintaining the disguise. The trigger mechanism was particularly sophisticated, using a sequential activation pattern that prevented accidental discharge while remaining simple enough to operate under stress. Technical documentation captured from NKVD archives after the Soviet collapse revealed that significant testing was conducted on barrel materials and ammunition modification to achieve reliable function within the dimensional constraints. Several prototype designs failed catastrophically during testing, with barrel ruptures or firing mechanism failures. The final production design represented iterative refinement rather than breakthrough innovation. The psychological dimension merits consideration. Targets approached by an operative carrying a flashlight in a dimly lit corridor or stairwell would naturally assume the flashlight served its stated purpose. This assumption provided the operative with the critical seconds required to close the distance and achieve firing position before the target recognized the threat. Witnesses observing from a distance would see an official or civilian carrying a common object, not a person carrying a weapon. This cognitive mismatch between appearance and function was exploited deliberately. The flashlight gun succeeded not because it was a superior firearm, but because it weaponized normalcy, transforming an utterly mundane object into a lethal instrument through engineering precision and operational doctrine. The collaborator killed in the Moscow apartment building in December 1941 was one of perhaps several hundred individuals eliminated using flashlight guns during the war. The NKVD officer who killed him filed a report noting successful completion of the assignment but providing no detail about the method beyond the standard designation. The weapon was returned to inventory after the operation, cleaned, reloaded, and reissued to another operative for another operation. The flashlight that looked like every other flashlight in Moscow continued functioning in its dual role until its barrel wore out or its mechanism failed, at which point it was likely destroyed and replaced. No monument commemorates those killed by flashlight guns. No museum displays surviving examples publicly. The weapon existed in the space between documented history and operational necessity, killing quietly and disappearing into the inventory records of an organization that no longer exists.